The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, carried by a London solicitor's clerk who had ridden through the night and arrived with mud on his coat and a satchel held across his chest, as though he had been told in very clear terms not to let go of it under any circumstances. He presented himself at the front door of Ashford Hall rather than the servants' entrance, which was the first thing that struck Mrs. Potts as wrong, and she had been housekeeper at Ashford Hall long enough to know that when things struck her as wrong, they generally were. She brought him to the front parlour, sent for the steward, and stood in the doorway with her hands folded in a way that suggested she intended to remain there, regardless of what anyone said to her about it. The steward came in from the East Fields, his coat carrying the particular smell of late autumn Yorkshire air, cold and damp and faintly of turned earth. He read the letter the clerk presented to him. He read it through once, then again. Then he looked up at Mrs. Potts, and something passed between them that Margaret Hale, standing on the upper landing with a book she had been meaning to return to the library, could not quite name. She saw his expression. She had been watching his expression for 2 years and thought she knew it reasonably well, and what she saw in it now was not surprise. What she saw, she would realize later, was the look of a man whose long patience had finally arrived at its destination. She did not yet understand what that meant. She would, before the afternoon was out. To understand what happened in that parlour on a grey October morning in 1845, it is necessary to go back 2 years. To the autumn of 1843, to the weeks following the death of her father. Robert Hale had been steward of Ashford Hall for 14 years. He was a careful man, methodical and honest, who kept the estate's accounts in a hand so precise that the columns could be read from across a room, and who had spent those 14 years making Ashford Hall function with a quiet efficiency that its absent owner, whoever that owner was at any given time, appeared to take entirely for granted. Margaret had grown up walking the estate grounds at his side, learning the names of the tenant farmers, the yields of the home fields, the particular temperament of the mill race in flood season. She had learned to read a ledger before she learned to properly embroider, which her mother had never entirely forgiven. Lady Cecily Hale was a woman of good family and reduced circumstance who had married Robert Hale in the belief that a steward's position at a great house was an acceptable compromise for a second daughter of the minor gentry, provided that it came with a comfortable cottage on the estate grounds and a certain proximity to the social world she had been raised to expect. For 14 years she had made the best of it, which in practice meant that she spent a considerable amount of energy distinguishing, in conversation and in manner, between the Hales of Ashford Hall and the household's actual servants, a distinction that no one in the surrounding neighbourhood seemed to find as significant as she required. When Robert Hale died of a fever in September of 1843, she found herself in the cottage with Margaret, a modest competence, and no particular claim on the great house's continued hospitality, except that the estate was without a steward and the situation, as Mrs. Potts observed carefully, to no one in particular, was not immediately resolved. The situation was resolved in the event by the arrival of a man who introduced himself as James Dawson and presented himself to Mrs. Potts with a letter of reference from a London firm of solicitors whose name Margaret did not recognise, but whose letterhead was impressively engraved. He was perhaps 35 years of age, tall, with the kind of economical posture that seemed to require no particular effort to maintain. His coat was plain, well made, and had been worn for long enough that it no longer looked new, which Margaret thought was the correct sort of coat for a working steward to have. He spoke to Mrs. Potts in measured, unornamented sentences and asked sensible questions about the estate's current condition, and within a fortnight he had taken a complete inventory of the outbuildings, reviewed all 14 years of her father's ledgers, and presented a written assessment of the home field's drainage problem that her father had been meaning to address for 3 seasons. Margaret formed her first impression of him in the estate library, where he had gone to consult the survey maps that were stored in the wide, flat drawers beneath the eastern shelves. She had gone to the library for the same purpose she went there every morning, which was to have an hour of quiet with a book before her mother found something that needed attending to. And she found him on his knees in front of the open drawer with 3 maps laid flat on the floor, studying them with the same precise attention he appeared to bring to everything. He looked up when she entered. He did not scramble to his feet in the way a man conscious of having been caught in a liberty might have done. He simply said, "Miss Hale, I hope I have not displaced you," and waited. She told him he had not. She stepped past him to the shelves and found her book. She was aware as she settled into the window chair that he had returned to the maps without any of the performance of industry that some men applied when a woman of the house was present, and she found this, in some way she did not immediately examine, to be a point in his favour. She offered him tea when Mrs. Potts brought the morning tray, and he accepted without ceremony. They sat in the library, she with her book and he with the survey maps on the writing table, and the fire made its small sounds, and outside the window the home park ran grey and bare under an October sky. It was not a remarkable morning. She would remember it for the rest of her life. Over the weeks that followed, a pattern established itself that neither of them appeared to have planned. The library was large enough for 2 people engaged in separate occupations to coexist without difficulty. And James Dawson's work frequently required the survey maps or the bound volumes of estate records on the lower shelves, and Margaret's mornings frequently required the window chair and a reasonable degree of quiet. They developed in the way that people sharing a space over time inevitably do, a set of small understandings. That she would pour the tea and he would move the maps from the table to make room for it, that he would bank the fire when he left if she was still reading, that certain questions about the estate's history, which he asked carefully and she answered from 14 years of absorbed observation, were welcomed on both sides and not made awkward by being named as welcomed. She noticed things about him. She could not help it. She noticed that his hands, when he set down a pen or turned a page, were the hands of a man who did not do heavy physical labour, despite the fact that he directed it daily. She noticed that when Mr. Granger from the neighbouring estate called on estate business and addressed him as Dawson in the flattening way that some men of property used when speaking to those they considered beneath them, James received this without any visible response, as though the name were a coat he was wearing for the occasion, and the dismissal were weather. She noticed that when Mrs. Potts addressed him, she addressed him with a particular attentiveness that was not quite deference, but was something adjacent to it, as though she were being careful about something she had decided not to name. Margaret did not ask. It was not her way to press where she sensed a boundary, and whatever boundaries James Dawson maintained around his origins and his history, they were his to keep. She did ask him, once, about the drainage problem in the lower field, because she had a theory about its cause that her father had dismissed as a girl's fancy, and she had been carrying the dismissal for 3 years. James set down his pen and listened to her in full, without any of the polite inattention that she had come to expect from men receiving opinions they had not requested. When she had finished, he said, "Your father may have been working from the Eastern Survey, which predates the mill race alteration by 20 years. The problem is further upstream than the old survey shows." He turned the map and showed her. She was right in the way that having been right about the cause of a thing that was then confirmed by a competent man with accurate maps counts as being right. She felt the small satisfaction of it settle quietly in her chest. The autumn of 1843 became the winter, and the winter became a long Yorkshire spring, with its late frosts and mud-churned lanes. And James Dawson settled into Ashford Hall's working life with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he had no intention of being anywhere else. The home field's drainage problem was resolved by summer using a method that combined her theory and his maps and the labour of 4 men and a good deal of carefully directed effort over 6 weeks. The tenant at the North Farm, a man named Thomas Carr, who had 2 young daughters and an ongoing quarrel with the estate over the condition of his barn roof, found the quarrel resolved without requiring him to petition anyone because James had inspected the roof in March and arranged for the timber in April. Margaret had brought bread and a pot of soup to the Carr cottage when the youngest daughter took a fever in January because she had been bringing things to the Carr cottage when they were needed for as long as she could remember and saw no reason to stop. James had been crossing the home field when she came back along the lane. They walked back toward the hall together, their breath making small clouds in the January air, and he said, "The youngest girl is better, I hope." "Improving," she said. "The fever broke yesterday. Mrs. Carr is a capable woman. She would have managed without me." "No doubt," he said. "You went anyway." It was not a question. She had no particular answer for it because he was correct, and the fact of its correctness seemed answer enough. They walked the rest of the lane in the kind of silence that 2 people settle into when they are comfortable enough not to fill it, and she noticed that the smoke from the hall's chimneys was already visible above the line of the elms, and that the cold had turned the park's wet grass to a low silver in the afternoon light, and that she was, in some way she had not fully examined, quite content. Her mother was less content. Lady Cecily had been applying herself to the problem of Margaret's future with the methodical intensity she brought to any project she considered urgent, and had, by the spring of 1844, arrived at a conclusion. The conclusion was Sir Reuben Graves. Sir Reuben was 51 years old and had made a considerable fortune in textile mills in the West Riding, which had purchased him a baronetcy 6 years prior and a townhouse in Harrogate, and which had not yet purchased him of the social standing in the county that he believed his income warranted. He was a large man with a loud manner of speaking and an approach to other people that suggested he was perpetually in the process of assessing their worth against a private scale whose units were pounds and acres. He had been introduced to Lady Cecily at a summer assembly in Harrogate in 1844, and had, over 2 subsequent visits to the cottage, made it clear that he was interested in an alliance with a family of respectable lineage, even a family of reduced circumstance, provided the lineage was genuine and the daughter was presentable. Margaret was presented to him at the cottage on a Thursday in September 1844. She wore her good grey dress and answered his questions politely and endured his manner of looking at her, which was the manner of a man studying something he was considering purchasing. And when he left, she told her mother that she did not think it likely to answer. Her mother told her that she was not required to think about it, and that what was required of her was the same gratitude she should have been showing for the past year, given their circumstances, given the precariousness of their position, given the fact that no young woman in her situation had the luxury of romantic sensibility. Margaret said nothing. She had learned over many years that the particular arguments her mother made when she was frightened were best met with quiet rather than with counter-argument, and she had no wish to be unkind. She understood in the part of her that had watched her mother navigate the estate's social hierarchies for 14 years, with the precision of a woman perpetually aware of how close to the edge she was standing, that the fear underneath the argument was genuine. She did not agree with what her mother proposed. She was not willing to pretend otherwise, but she understood the fear, and she kept her voice level. In the library the following morning she was quiet in a way that James evidently noticed, because he set down his pen and looked at her for a moment, and then said, "The Eastfield accounts are out by 6 shillings, but I think I know where it went if you want something to work through." She looked at him. "You have been reading the same page for 20 minutes," he said. Not unkindly. She set the book down. "My mother has found a prospective match." He said nothing. He waited in the way he had of waiting that communicated both patience and attention without any pressure. "A Sir Reuben Graves," she said, "from Harrogate." James looked at the ledger on the table. Then he looked back at her. "Is it what you want?" "No," she said. The simplicity of her answer appeared to satisfy some question he had not asked aloud. He turned back to the ledger. "6 shillings," he said. "Thomas Carr's barn repair in April. I forgot to allocate it separately from the general works column. A small error." She picked up the pen and found the column, and they worked through it together, and the fire burned steadily, and the morning passed in its usual way, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that the weight that had settled in her chest the previous evening had eased somewhat. Through the winter of 1844 and into 1845, Sir Reuben's visits to the cottage became more regular, and Lady Cecily's management of Margaret's schedule during those visits became more deliberate. She was placed in the front parlour when he called. She was directed to wear the pale blue muslin, which her mother considered more flattering, for the Harrogate assembly where Sir Reuben expected to be seen with her. She was told on 3 separate occasions in 3 separate ways that her behaviour toward the household steward, specifically the amount of time she spent in the library in his company, was unsuitable, and that Sir Reuben had remarked upon it. "He remarked upon it," Margaret said. "He expressed concern," her mother said, "which is a reasonable concern for a man in his position to have about a woman he is proposing to honour." "He spoke of it to you directly." "He mentioned it in the way a man mentions something he expects to be addressed." Margaret smoothed the front of her dress with one hand, a gesture her mother had noted before and disliked. "Then I will address it," she said, which her mother took for compliance and was not. She continued to use the library. She reduced the frequency of her mornings there out of a practical awareness that open defiance of her mother served no one. But she did not stop. The Eastfield accounts still needed reviewing. The survey of the North Wood boundary remained incomplete, and the books were in the library, where they had always been. She and James continued to drink tea by the window and to discuss the estate's practical management with the same unforced directness they had always brought to it, and she was aware that he had noticed her mother's campaign and was aware that she had not capitulated to it, and neither of them named what that meant. In September of 1845, her mother announced the betrothal formally. Not to Margaret first, but to Mrs. Potts and the cook, and, Margaret was fairly certain, to 2 families in the village, before she called Margaret into the front parlour on a Tuesday morning and presented it to her as a concluded arrangement. Sir Reuben had made a formal offer. Her mother had accepted it on her behalf. The wedding was proposed for the following spring. Margaret sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the embroidered fire screen and said, "You accepted it without consulting me. You are my daughter, and you are 22 years old, and you have no income and no particular prospects, and I have consulted your interests extensively," her mother said. "Sir Reuben is a wealthy man. He will provide for you materially in a way that I cannot, and the time for romantic reservations is past." "I have expressed no romantic reservations," Margaret said. "I have expressed a considered objection to being arranged." "Then you will adjust your consideration," her mother said, "because it is done." The following 3 weeks were the quietest Margaret had spent in her mother's house. She answered correspondence, took her morning walks, helped Mrs. Potts with the October linen inventory, and sat in the library in the mornings with the composure of a woman who has decided that composure is the only instrument currently available to her. James said nothing about the betrothal because he had not been told of it by her, and would not have had it from a servant. But she thought he knew. He had always known more about the state of Ashford Hall than anyone had specifically told him. She found out, in the way one always finds out the worst things, not through a formal conversation, but through a door left insufficiently closed. It was a Thursday evening in mid-October. She had come down from her room late in the afternoon to return a volume to the library and had heard, through the door that opened from the corridor onto the drawing room where her mother was entertaining Sir Reuben at tea, the sound of her own name. She stopped. She was not eavesdropping. She had simply arrived at an unfortunate moment and was now standing in a corridor, learning what she was not meant to hear. Her mother's voice. Margaret is a capable girl, but she has some of her father's stubbornness, I'm afraid. She thinks highly of her own opinions. But she has been raised in this house and she knows how to conduct herself, and the stubbornness will find fewer outlets once she is properly settled. Sir Reuben's voice, comfortable and expansive in the way it always was. I'm not looking for opinions. I want a woman who will manage the house and present well and not make difficulties. The rest of it can be managed. She will not make difficulties, her mother said. You have my assurance on that. The business with the steward, he said. I've heard she favours his company. An old habit, her mother said. Her father's influence. She will be corrected. A pause. The sound of a teacup. She is not what I would have chosen first, Sir Reuben said, but the name is good, and the face is adequate, and it will serve the purpose. Margaret stood in the corridor with the book held flat against her side, and breathed once, carefully, and then walked to the library and closed the door behind her. She placed the book on the table. The fire was low. She did not build it up. She sat in the window chair for a long time looking at the home park, which was dark now except for the faint outline of the elms against a sky that still held a thin grey light along the horizon. The face is adequate, she thought, and it will serve the purpose. She thought about her father, who had never spoken of her face in any context, except to say, once, on a winter evening very like this one, that she had her grandmother's eyes and that her grandmother had been the sharpest reader of character in the county, and that this was worth considerably more than a pretty chin. She thought about 14 years of ledgers in her father's precise hand, kept faithfully for an estate whose owner rarely visited, and of the drainage problem in the lower field that had been waiting for someone to look at an accurate map, and of Thomas Carr's daughters, who called her Miss Hale and brought her apples from their tree in September because she had brought soup in January. She was, she decided, not going to become something that served a purpose. The next morning, she went to the library early before James arrived and reviewed the survey of the North Wood boundary that they had left unfinished the previous week. She made notes in the margin in her own hand. She had the notes ready when he came in at 8:30 with mud on his boots and the look of a man who had already been out in the cold for an hour. He looked at the map. He looked at her notes. He said, "You've found the encroachment." "The boundary stone on the north side has been moved," she said. 12 feet, approximately, to the east. It's been moved for some time, but the original survey position is clear from the old drainage channel. The Granger estate has been pasturing 2 fields on land that belongs to Ashford. He studied the map for a long moment. "This will need to be addressed formally," he said. "A letter to the solicitors in London." "I thought as much," she said. "I can draft it, if you would like." He looked at her then, not with the look of a man approving a subordinate's initiative, but with something quieter and more particular, the look she had learned in 2 years to recognize as the version of attention that meant he was seeing her exactly as she was, and not as any of the things the room required her to be. "I would like that very much," he said. She wrote the letter that morning. He made 2 small corrections to the legal phrasing and none to anything else, and sent it to London by the afternoon post. Then she did the thing her mother had forbidden. Thomas Carr's younger daughter, the one who had been ill the previous January, had turned 6 in the summer and had taken a bad fall from the field gate in the first week of October, and hurt her arm badly enough that it had been set by the doctor from Ripon, but had healed crookedly, and the doctor had said that if it was seen to promptly by a better surgeon in York, it might still be corrected, but that the cost of such a visit and such treatment was beyond what Carr could manage this side of the harvest settlement. Lady Cecily had heard of this and had told Margaret in explicit terms that the Carr family's difficulties were the business of the estate and not of the steward's daughter, particularly one whose social position was in the process of being repaired and who could not afford to be seen engaging in charitable performances that would be noted and discussed. Margaret took £10 from her own small savings, which represented most of what she had put aside over 3 years of careful economy, and arranged with Mrs. Potts for the Carr child to travel to York with the housekeeper's own niece, who had occasion to go there the following week and would see that the child reached the surgeon's rooms and was seen and settled and brought safely home. She told Thomas Carr herself on a cold morning walk past the North Farm, and watched him stand in his farmyard and say nothing for a moment and then say only, "Thank you, Miss Hale," in a voice that had very little to do with politeness. Her mother found out within 3 days and said everything Margaret had expected her to say. Margaret listened to it all from beginning to end without interrupting, and then said, "It was the right thing to do." "It was an act of disobedience," her mother said. "Sir Reuben will hear of it." "I expect he will," Margaret said. The London solicitor's clerk arrived the following Tuesday, as described, with mud on his coat and a satchel he would not release. He asked for the estate steward. Mrs. Potts brought him to the front parlour. James came in from the East Fields and read the letter once, and then again, and looked at Mrs. Potts with that expression that was not surprise. And Margaret stood on the upper landing with a book she had been meaning to return and watched it all through the balustrade. She came downstairs an hour later. James was in the library. The solicitor's clerk was still in the front parlour with Mrs. Potts, who appeared to be providing him with tea and a degree of firm company that discouraged him from wandering. She opened the library door. He was standing at the writing table with the letter in his hands, looking at nothing in particular, and when she entered he turned to face her. The letter was on the table. She could see, even from across the room, that the wax seal was red, and that the crest pressed into it was the Ashford crest, which she knew well because she had been looking at it on estate documents since childhood. She could also see that the letter was addressed to the Earl of Ashford, and had been forwarded to Ashford Hall, care of Mr. James Dawson, which made a kind of sense that it had not made this morning, and that now, standing in the library doorway with the morning light coming through the east windows, made a great deal of sense all at once. She looked at the seal. She looked at him. "Your name," she said, "is not James Dawson." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "James is correct. Dawson is my mother's family name. I have used it on occasion." "The Earl of Ashford," she said. The formality of the title in her own voice felt strange, like fitting a key she had been carrying for 2 years into a lock she had not known she was looking for. "James Ashford," he said. "Yes." She stood very still. The fire was in the grate. The survey maps were on the table. The Eastfield ledger was open at the page they had been reviewing together 3 days ago. 2 years, she said. "Yes." He did not offer an explanation, and she found that she did not, at this particular moment, require one. She had been watching him for 2 years. She knew what kind of man he was. Whatever the reasons were, they were the reasons of the man she had come to know in this library and on these fields, and that man had reviewed her father's accounts with care, and resolved Thomas Carr's barn roof, and listened to her theory about the drainage problem, and been correct about the upstream cause, and not once in 2 years. treated her as anything other than the person she was. "My mother," she said, "and Sir Reuben." Something moved in his expression. "They are in the drawing room," he said. The solicitor's clerk brought a secondary communication that requires the household to be addressed. "Sir Reuben arrived this morning, as it happens. Your mother invited him to be present for what she anticipated would be a different sort of conversation. She anticipated the solicitor's arrival. She anticipated being told that the estate's new owner had been confirmed and that the Hale family's position here was consequently uncertain," he said. She intended Sir Reuben to be present as evidence of Margaret Hale's secured future, should the conversation require it. The clarity of this, the picture of her mother's manoeuvring rendered in plain description, was both entirely in keeping with what she knew of her mother and entirely cold. She felt the coldness of it pass through her and settle. "Then we should go," she said. The drawing room at Ashford Hall was a well-proportioned room with pale plaster walls and tall windows that looked out over the south lawn, and it held, on that October Tuesday afternoon, 5 people. Lady Cecily at the writing desk, Sir Reuben Graves near the fire, Mrs. Potts in the doorway, the solicitor's clerk standing with his satchel near the window, and Margaret, who had come in ahead of James, and stood now near the far end of the room, having learned very young that a room is easier to read from its edges. James came through the door last and stopped just inside it. Lady Cecily looked up from the writing desk. She had prepared herself for this meeting in her best morning dress, and with the expression she deployed for occasions that required composure, and the expression when she saw James standing in the doorway without the estate ledger he typically carried when summoned, shifted in a way that suggested she was revising several calculations simultaneously. Sir Reuben turned from the fire. He looked at James the way he always looked at the household steward, which was not quite looking, in the way that a man looks at a piece of furniture as something that defines the room without particularly warranting attention. "Ah," he said, "the steward. What is all this business about?" The solicitor's clerk opened his satchel. He produced a second letter, this one sealed with the same red wax and the same Ashford crest, and he addressed it not to the room in general, but specifically and clearly to the man in the doorway. "My lord," he said, "the London office has forwarded the estate management correspondence as instructed, and wishes to convey that all matters have been arranged to your satisfaction." The room received this in a silence that had a particular quality to it, the quality of several people revising their understanding of the last several minutes, and, in Lady Cecily's case, of the last several years. Sir Reuben looked at the clerk. He looked at James. Something crossed his face that was not quite understanding but was in the process of becoming it. "I beg your pardon," he said. "My lord." James looked at him with the polite steadiness of a man who had spent 2 years being regarded as a piece of furniture and found the experience mildly informative. "The Earl of Ashford," he said with the minimal sufficient calm of a man stating a fact about the weather. "I have been managing this estate directly for the past 2 years. I apologize for any confusion my method of management may have caused." The confusion it had caused was, at this moment, most visibly concentrated in Lady Cecily, who had risen from the writing desk and was looking at James with an expression that had passed through several stages and arrived at a kind of pale, arrested recognition. She looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at her mother, quietly, from the edge of the room. "Lady Cecily," James said, "you and Miss Hale are welcome at Ashford Hall for as long as is comfortable and convenient. Your circumstances here have not changed, and will not change." This was, Margaret understood, a kindness. It was offered without conditions and without any visible awareness of the conversation that had been held in this drawing-room a fortnight ago, the one about faces that were adequate and purposes that were served. If he knew about that conversation and she thought it likely that he had known about several things she had not specifically told him, he did not use it. He offered her mother the shelter of a graceful exit and left it open. Lady Cecily sat back down. She said nothing. It was, Margaret thought, one of the very few times in her adult life that she had watched her mother have nothing to say. Sir Reuben found words more readily. "Well," he said, "this is rather irregular. I had understood that Miss Hale was in a position to—" "Miss Hale," James said with a gentleness that was also unmistakably final, "is in whatever position she chooses to occupy. I believe the arrangement you had proposed to Lady Cecily was made without Miss Hale's full consent, and I believe it is concluded." Sir Reuben opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the room, at the clerk with his official satchel, at Mrs. Potts in the doorway with her folded hands, at Lady Cecily sitting deflated at the writing desk, at Margaret standing quietly at the room's edge. He said, "I see," in the tone of a man who had arrived with a specific expectation of the morning and was adjusting to the fact that the morning had declined to cooperate. He made his farewells with a thoroughness that was almost admirable given the circumstances, collected his hat and gloves from the hall table, and was gone by 3:30. Mrs. Potts closed the front door behind him with the quiet, measured care of a woman who had been wanting to close a particular door for quite some time. The drawing room was still. Lady Cecily remained at the desk. She was looking at her hands in her lap with the expression of a woman calculating something whose sums she could not quite make work, and Margaret felt for her in the way one feels for a person who has been trying very hard by the wrong means, the kind of tired sorrow that is not quite forgiveness, but is the space where forgiveness might eventually live. She went to her mother and sat with her for a few minutes, not speaking. Her mother did not speak either. After a time, Lady Cecily said, "I did not know," which was true as far as it went, and which was all she said. James had gone out by then. She found him in the library an hour later, standing at the east window where she usually sat, looking out at the home park in the low afternoon light. The fire had been built up. The survey maps were folded and returned to their drawers. The Eastfield ledger was closed on the table. She came to stand beside him at the window. They watched the elms for a moment in the way they had both learned to share this room. "The North Wood boundary letter," she said. "Will it require any further action?" "The solicitors will address it," he said. "The boundary stone will need to be restored. Mr. Granger will make difficulties, but the survey documentation is clear." "I thought as much," she said. A pause. The fire. Outside, the first rooks crossing the grey sky toward the wood. "I should have told you sooner," he said. She considered this honestly. "Perhaps," she said. "Though I think if you had, you would have seen something different." He turned to look at her. "Different how?" "You would have seen the performance of myself," she said, "instead of the plain article." He was quiet for a moment. "The plain article," he said, "is what I was looking for." She did not answer this immediately because it did not require immediate answering. It required, instead, the particular stillness that surrounds a thing when it has finally been said aloud after a very long time of being true. She thought of the January morning and the soup and the cold lane and the smoke above the elms. She thought of 6 shillings allocated incorrectly to the general works column and found again together. She thought of the car child, whose arm had been set properly by the York surgeon, and who had brought Margaret a small bunch of field flowers last week with the solemnity of a 6-year-old performing an act of great importance. "The car girl is healing well," she said. "I heard," he said, "from Mrs. Potts. Mrs. Potts hears most things." "She has been remarkably discreet," he said. For a woman who knew for longer than you did. Margaret looked at him. She knew. From the first week, I think. She is a great deal more perceptive than most people have given her credit for. Margaret thought of Mrs. Potts in the drawing-room doorway with her folded hands. She thought of 2 years of small, careful kindnesses that might have been slightly less unconscious than she had assumed. "I shall have to reproach her," she said. "I shouldn't," he said. "She kept it rather better than I had any right to expect." The afternoon light was changing, flattening toward evening, and the elms were darker now against the paler sky. She thought of the evening she had sat in this chair and looked at this window, and heard the word adequate applied to her face in the voice of a man who had not thought she was worth a considered opinion. She thought of the weight of that evening and of how completely, in the course of an afternoon, the room had rearranged itself. "I will need to speak to my mother," she said, "about what happens next." "There is no urgency," he said. "Your place here is settled. It has been settled for 2 years, in the only sense that matters to me." She looked at the home park, at the particular shade of grey the Yorkshire sky made over a field in late October, at the line of the elms and the distant roof of the North Farm, and the gate through which she had walked on 100 mornings. This landscape was as familiar to her as her own hands. She had walked it with her father, and she had walked it alone, and she had walked it with a man she had known as James Dawson, and now knew as James Ashford, and it was the same landscape, and she was the same person, and everything else had changed in the way that things change when a room finally arranges itself to match what has always been true. She had been in this library the morning of his first day. She had offered him tea when Mrs. Potts brought the tray, without ceremony or calculation, because it was the natural thing to do, because he was in the room and the tea was there, and she did not see. Then as now, what rank had to do with it? She thought this was perhaps the thing she would tell her children, when she had them, about this year and this house and this man who had arrived in October, with a well-worn coat and a letter of reference, and an uncommon ability to listen. She turned away from the window. He was still there. She picked up her book from the table where she had left it that morning, the volume she had been meaning to return, now thoroughly returned. "Tomorrow," she said, "there are the ledger pages for the Southfields winter account, if you have time." He was already at the shelves, finding the volume she had missed, sliding it into the gap it had left. "I have time," he said without turning, as though it were the simplest thing, as though it had never been otherwise, as though Ashford Hall's library at first light were exactly where they were both going to be. The fire settled. Outside, the rooks had found the wood. The home park was darkening now toward evening, and the elms stood in their long, familiar line, and the smoke from the hall's chimneys rose straight up into still October air. And inside the library at Ashford Hall, the fire made its small sound, and the books stood in their shelves where they had always been, and Margaret Hale set her hand on the back of the window chair that had been her chair for as long as she could remember. And it was enough, and it was entirely her own, and she was home.